and gentlemen, and welcome to a new Warframe guide. This is going to be a slightly different focus this time. This is going to be extending on a previous guide we did of the general introduction to Eidolons. There'll be a link down in the description of the video to show you the previous video. And if you want to know more, then watch this, because we're going to be looking into the semantics of each frame, some weapons, and focus trees. We're going to look at much more detail of how to get potency out of your frames, your weapons, and all that jazz. So, pay attention, young Padawan, and we shall learn to fight the Eidolons with great vigor.
Hello there.
So right off the bat, Eidolons, as mentioned, are immune to frame abilities. So you would not want to bring frames like Ember, Excalibur. You can, but you have to realize that you have to set your expectations based on what you bring. The better setup you bring, the more Eidolons you'll kill. So when it comes to choosing what you use for an Eidolon run, do your research. Figure out what works and what doesn't, or what just isn't optimal. Because then you're going to be going in and figuring out how many you're going to kill. You're going to look at your setup. So if you go in with an Excalibur with a Motamp, for example, you know, you're not going to really do too well. You might still kill a Terrorist, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But we're here to show you how to get the most out of these runs. We won't be looking at amps, as that will be a separate video entirely, and we will make a third part of this guide eventually that will cover gimmicks and alternative methods of fighting Eidolons that can be quite fun and quite interesting. First of all, we're going to take a look at the healers. Now, in a generalized setup, you always want to have at least one healer. That way you can keep your Eidolon lures alive. Trinity, fundamentally, is the most used because of the simplicity she brings as well as the potent healing. In terms of builds, you'll be using a Blessing build. This is to make use of your potency with your Blessing. Your Blessing gives damage mitigation, it's an instant heal, and it's very simple to use. So the fundamentality of new players is you want Trinity for simplicity's sake. A build will focus on duration to make the Blessing last as long as possible. You're going to look at getting at least 150% power strength to get a high enough damage mitigation buff. Bear in mind, you can't physically go above a 75% damage mitigation buff. Getting that 75% damage mitigation will take about 155% power strength to get there. I have a Trinity guide that goes over her playstyles and how she works, which will be linked in the description of the stream in the video as well. When you're playing Trinity, you are essentially running around the map. You have the fundamental task as a Trinity to look after the Eidolon lures. What you need to do as a Trinity, the second you get out the door, you're not going to go to the Eidolon, you're going to be looking around the map to find the Eidolon lures. As mentioned in the first video, Eidolon lures are 100% mandatory, and as a Trinity, you must keep an eye on these. As the Trinity, you will be going around picking them all up from the Pyrenean camps. You're going to hack them, you're going to let them follow you. A big suggestion is, don't pick up too many, because otherwise you're going to have to then be worrying about the Eidolon lures fully charging easily. If you pick up two, right off the bat when you first get out, let them charge, and then as every time a limb is destroyed, or potentially once the Eidolon has lost all of its limbs and it goes into the phase 2 where it cries like a little baby, you then have some time to pick up additional Eidolon lures. Do not worry about your DPS as a Trinity. Fundamentally, you are there to heal. You are there to babysit the Eidolon lures. If you're new and you're worried about losing the Eidolon lures, don't worry about damage, just keep an eye on them, and always make sure that the Eidolon lures are within 80 meters. After they exceed that distance, they no longer tether to the Eidolon. So, as a Trinity, you are fundamentally the most important player in the group. As a good Trinity, or heck, even a good Oberon, you will be having your codgers sucked by your teammate for being a good player. Oberon is the second of the healer frames that people will often choose. Although he is a lot more complicated to get the potency out of him, he is a very viable alternative. Much like the Trinity, you will be babysitting the Eidolon lures, you'll be keeping your team alive, and you'll be getting your codgers sucked if you do a good job. So, do a good job as Oberon and you will reap the rewards. But whereas Trinity is simplicity in the form of an instant heal and damage mitigation, Oberon has a lot more to him. Right off the bat, Oberon has his healing from his renewal. He has the status immunity from his scorched earth, or the flowers he summons all around him. This is great for when the Eidolons produce a magnetic pulse, or when they deal excess amounts of magnetic damage. You can completely nullify those status effects with that ability. On top of that as well, you also have an augment called Smite Infusion. Smite Infusion gives you bonus radiation damage to your team when you use your Smite on them. This is exceptionally useful and can add to that damage. In terms of build, you're looking at generally having a little bit of range, a little bit of duration, a little bit of survivability, and as much power as possible to make your Smite and Fusion as strong as possible. This can be jiggered around a little bit to focus more on healing if you don't want to use Smite and Fusel. Really, Oberon has a lot of variety in how you play him when it comes to Eidolons. Focus on range for healing, focus on power for Smite and Fusel. Everything else is down to personal preference, but let it be known that his playstyle, when it actually comes down to fighting the Eidolon, is much the same as Trinity. You need to be a little bit more positionally aware with your Eidolon lures, as your healing is going to be subjective to where you are by comparison to them, whereas Trinity's is just instant. So, if you want the comparison between the two, Trinity for simplicity, Oberon for the extra things he brings to the table. Now we move on to the buffing frames. These are the main 5 frames, as we mentioned in the previous video, that will give your team the biggest buffs possible when it comes to giving your weapons more damage. Rhino, as mentioned in the previous video, is one of the most fundamental used frames for beginners because he is simple, he's easy to mod, he's easy to obtain, he's easy to play, and he gives good survivability. So right off the bat with Rhino, you're going to be focusing on using your 2 to stay alive with Iron Skin. Your 3 is going to increase the potency of your team's survival, and you can even use your Rhino Stomp to shred the exoskeleton of the Vombalists when they are getting close to the Eidolon, although that won't be a priority. All you need to do as a Rhino, make sure one of 2 things is happening. 1, your 3 is active as much as possible. 2, make sure your 2 is active as much as possible. It is highly likely that as a Rhino, you will be dealing the majority of the damage unless there may be a Chroma in the group. So, to make the most use of your Rhino, you need to build as much power strength as possible to make sure your 3 is as strong as possible. I currently have a build that runs 304% power strength, which is very bad for efficiency. However, it does give you a humongous 152% damage buff, which is multiplicative rather than just additive. And this will give you exponentially more damage as well as to your team, allowing you to kill those limbs off very quickly. Adding in a smidge of armor into that build as well will also increase your survivability exponentially. You don't need to put any efficiency in here, although you could then swap out something like Augur Secrets, maybe the Blind Rage for that efficiency if you want to be able to cast it more efficiently. It's down to personal preference though. Just let me know that if you really want to kill these limbs quickly and easily, that power strength is where it lies. Chroma is the next of the buff frames, and as I've mentioned in the first video as well, Chroma reflects very similarly with Rhino in the sense that he is essentially just a buff frame. He is there to give an immense power strength buff with his Vex armor, as well as some half-decent survivability. However, there's a bit of a gimmick to making this work, as this Vex armor is only propagated through the act of taking damage. When you take health damage, you build up the one buff, and when you take shield damage, you build up the other. So the idea is here is, because there's a natural amount of damage going out anyway, you don't really need to worry too much about dealing self-damage, but it's always worth bringing it maybe an explosive weapon of some kind to deal some self-damage to help boost that up if it falls off. You are going to be starved for energy as well, and most of Chroma's abilities are very, very energy heavy. So you want to try and make sure you keep your buff up as long as possible, or time it to the point where it's going to be most efficient for killing a limb. When it comes to your abilities, your elemental armor should essentially be red to make sure you gain as much health as possible, which will allow you to gain a buff more efficiently without dying, as red energy on a Chroma will give you bonus health. The Vex armor is then going to be propagated by power strength. The more power strength you build, the bigger your buff will come from your Vex armor. I currently run a build with 328% power strength and no efficiency, with 1 efficiency on the streamline. It's still entirely doable, and this works immensely well for pretty much one-shotting the limbs. In fact, a lot of the times, Chroma is the one who will more often than not be the one killing the limbs, as this power strength buff is huge. As I said, it works very similar to how Rhino works, just with a little bit more finickiness with actually keeping it up. You will definitely want to try and bring energy pads to make sure this keeps up as long as possible whilst you're using it. You do want to take some health with Vitality to make sure you can make use of the elemental armor. Having a little bit of armor built in there as well can also benefit that as well. Staying alive and keeping your buff up will be very important, as if you die or let the buff drop off, that's a lot of energy you then need to get back through the Trinity or through some energy pads in order to then cast it again. But you are the main damage. You do not have much of any other role when it comes to Eidolons as a Chroma, other than just absolutely destroying those limbs. Use this in conjunction with Multi-Shot from an Octavia, or the shields with a Volt, and you will very satisfyingly feel as though you're destroying those limbs quickly. Even with a very unoptimized weapon, this Chroma buff mixed with a Harrow buff or a Volt buff will shred limbs. The next frame we're looking at is a little bit of a finicky one. This is Octavia. She is by far and away the least used frame for Eidolons, and there's a couple of reasons for this. Most namely being is because she's a little bit inconsistent with keeping her buffs active at any given time. Keeping them efficiently up and all that jazz is kind of difficult with the way they work. But let's go over why you would use her first. So the reason you would use Octavia, one, her amp gives a very powerful damage buff through the potency of scale ability. So building power strength will then increase the potency of this multiplier. So you definitely want some power strength for that. Alternatively, you also then get multi-shot through her metronome using the opera buff, which is obtained by firing your weapons in time with the metronome. So not only do you get multi-shot and also bonus damage, but you also get mitigation through her buff as well. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, this sounds like an amazing thing to do. Yes, it is amazing fundamentally. However, obtaining these buffs, keeping them up efficiently, and maintaining them is a nightmare. Because the Eidolon is always moving, and because the energy is never going to be consistent, keeping these buffs active is hard. So this comes down to the fundamental of simplicity versus complexity, much like why you would use Rhino over Chroma for the sake of simplicity. However, if you can keep them active and you're a good Octavia, it is definitely a good addition to any team. On top of that, the Roller mixed with the Thumper, the Resonator even, allows for a consistent damage rolling around to strip the exoskeleton of any Vombalist. So not only can you clear up Vombalists easier, but it allows the Eidolon lures to eat them more efficiently as well. Which is fundamentally an amazing thing to do when it comes to keeping things clean, keeping the damage down, and then charging your Eidolon lures more efficiently. If you are going to play Octavia, I would recommend one of two builds. Either go for an all-round build, where you build for duration, efficiency, range, and strength evenly. That way it can be easy to keep up your abilities whilst also affecting everything efficiently. Alternatively, you sacrifice a little bit of efficiency and strength and you go for as much range as possible to make sure your team are benefiting from those buffs, as well as also shredding the Vombalists as efficiently as possible as well. Just keep an eye on this. This is a hard one to do. I would highly advise researching your Octavia play before you go out there with her. She is just a good addition if your team already has filled in the other three roles of a healer, having a Harrow and maybe a Vault, and then putting Octavia out there is definitely not a bad choice. Moving on to Vault. This is one of the most fundamentally used frames for an Eidolon group, and in my recommendation is always one you should bring. For the main reason being of his shields. Vault shields are one of the only buffs in the game that will consistently and efficiently buff your operators throughout the entirety of an Eidolon fight. On top of that, it then adds to your regular weapon damage as well. Each of these shields will give electrical damage and bonus critical damage, so you want to have these in a group at any given time. Although you only need to put one shield down for the operator, as it will only benefit from the crit damage, the electric damage does stack with each shield, and I will leave a link to our Vault guide down below that goes into more detail as to how he works. As Vault, you will want to use your sprint to help your team keep up with the Eidolon, and placing your shields in the pathing of the Eidolon will allow you to have as much uptime as possible with his shields. Every time an Eidolon loses a limb, they'll collapse, allowing you to get underneath them and place the shield facing upwards. This in turn will allow your team to shoot up through the Eidolon, allowing their amps to cleave more efficiently. So using Vault is amazing. You definitely want him in your team at any given time. In terms of build, you actually don't need much of anything. My recommendation is to go as much duration as possible to make sure your shields are up for as long as possible. Having natural talents up for the casting speed of the shield is very nice for when the Eidolon is killable and when you're able to take down the limbs. And then it's all about making sure you have the efficiency and duration to keep them up as long as possible. A bit of survivability goes a long way as well. Shock Trooper can be nice for that bonus electrical damage for your team when you want to destroy a limb or just kill off the Eidolon entirely. So use this to your advantage, play it the way you see would work for you. And the fifth and final of the meta frames that you would want to take on an Eidolon run is Harrow. Fundamentally, one of the most used frames as well. The reason being is because along with Oberon, he is one of the only frames that can give you immunity to status effects. Those pesky magnetic procs that always ruin your art shielding as well as also your energy can be completely nullified by using Harrow. The playstyle is quite simple. You may even want to avoid damaging to focus on making sure that you're there in your support role, as Harrow's 4 is where the status immunity comes from. Every time an Eidolon loses a limb, they'll generate a massive radial explosion, which allows you to make use of your 4. When you activate your 4, you'll gain a moment of complete damage immunity as you spin up and start absorbing damage. During this moment, any damage absorbed will then turn into bonus critical chance buff for your team, which is a really nice buff and can definitely add to killing off an Eidolon or the limbs very efficiently. But the status immunity you gain in that moment is also very fundamentally useful. In turn, you can then also deal damage yourself should you wish, and Harrow is also used as a solo frame for Eidolons, funnily enough. This in turn also uses as a support role to keep your Eidolon lures alive as well. So not only do you get the bonus damage, not only do you get the survivability through status immunity as well as damage mitigation, or sorry, damage immunity in general, you also look damn badass while you do it. In terms of a build, you actually need to be very careful here because you want to go for minimal, if not minus duration. The reason being is because the timing of your 4 with having bonus duration is so long that you may not be able to cast in time to cast it again for the next time a limb is destroyed. So you want to go to about 90% duration in order to be able to cast this as and when you need to, rather than waiting for it to run off and maybe not have it ready in time for the next one. This can be achieved quite easily with just having continuity and then using fleeting expertise for the efficiency along with streamline. Having a little bit of power strength to add to the benefit bonus of your buffs is also quite nice as well, but the main thing is you want that 90% duration. You can be quite creative and ingenuitive with the builds you use on this, so long as you get that minus duration. That is the fundamental part of this build, however. Now, before we go any further, there's one guest of honor mention that we need to make here, and that is towards your focus schools. There are 2 focus schools that will benefit you the most when it comes to Eidolons. The first one being Madurai. Madurai is a great focus tree that has a lot of utility across the board, but there is one element to this that will benefit your operated damage greatly. And when it comes to operated damage, your operated damage is 100 times more important than any of your other damage that you do with weapons or anything else. The specific reason being is because the faster you kill the shields, the quicker the Eidolon dies. And whereas with your main weapons, you can kill off limbs very easily in one hit, getting beneficial operated damage is a much harder thing to do. So synergizing with Vault Shields as well as other buffs for your operator is where the damage and potency of your amps will come. We will have a guide in the near future about how to set up your amps specifically. We do have a link in the description of the video as well to a amp setup table, which will show you the different amp combinations. But without going into too much detail about the amps, we'll look at more of the focus tree here. So as mentioned, the Madurai tree has Void Strike. Now, Void Strike fundamentally is essentially more damage as you crouch. When you crouch in operator mode, this will generate a buff in your buff window, which increases the longer you crouch for. The longer you crouch, the bigger it builds, and it is a multiplicative buff. So as it builds, it exponentially gets stronger and stronger and stronger. To make the most use of this, you want to be generating this buff as you're waiting for Eidolon to get back on its feet, or between the Eidolons. So any opportunity where you're not needing to avoid damage or shoot a limb, you want to be crouching in operator mode to build this buff up as you go. Anything above a 2.0 or a 2.5 multiplier will allow you to near enough one-shot shields if you then get a bonus vault buff with Unaru. But it also then kind of depends on the amp you use as well. But without going into too much detail, Void Strike is fundamentally amazing. The second focus tree you are going to want to look at is Unaru Wisp. This is a mildly annoying and high micro-intensive ability from the Unaru tree. When you Void Blast an enemy, they will generate a Void Wisp. Now, this is going to be the annoying part, because actually finding this Wisp and making sure you pick it up is the hard part, because it's tiny! It is quite literally so incredibly small. You would more likely find a micro penis than find this thing. Seriously, when you use Void Blast, double check it's spawned, make sure you pick it up, because this will give you a bonus 100% damage to your operator. And the great thing about this is it stacks with the Madurai tree. So as mentioned before, if you build up a good stack with your Madurai tree, then pick up an Unaru tree buff, you gain immense damage to your operator. And this is where the synergy comes in. If you can synergize your Madurai with your Unaru, and you have a good team set up with a couple people with Madurai, a couple people with Unaru, you will find that the shields of an Eidolon will disappear instantly. And as one last little final addition to this in-depth guide, we're going to have a little better look at the weapons you're using. Now, before we go into any detail with this, we're going to look at the weapons you definitely don't use. The reason being is because there are certain weapons that will just simply not work, or work efficiently. May I remind you that you can use any weapon should you wish, just set your expectations based on the weapon you bring. If it's a bad weapon for Eidolons, it's not going to work well. Shotguns, except the Archiplasmal, grenade launchers, and bows, and generally speaking melee weapons, are a big no-go. Grenade launchers and bows are either too slow, and a single missed shot will cause you to lose an immense amount of damage. There are, however, some gimmicks here, and again, these are just a generalization of what you don't want to use. The shotguns are also, although they may have a high amount of base damage, they're going to be mitigated very heavily because the damage you deal is mitigated through each individual buckshot you deal, which is why the Archiplasmal can be quite good because it's a single chunky shot. So, for example, if you fire a Tigris, each of those individual buckshots you fire, although together do a lot of damage, individually they're getting mitigated to the point where they're not even doing that much. With some, you can make them work with a very powerful Riven, but you have to keep in mind, why use something that's okay when you could just use something that's optimal? And that's what we'll look at now. The main weapons to be used, as mentioned in the first guide, are Rubico being the first. Rubico is an immensely powerful sniper rifle. With any sniper rifle, they all automatically have a very big benefit in the sense that they build a combo, much like melee weapons. As they hit a target, this combo meter builds, allowing them to deal more damage. This is initially crit damage that scales with the multiplier, which is why if you are modding a sniper rifle, building additional crit damage is not near as beneficial as building additional crit chance. Crit damage and crit chance are going to be scaled much more exponentially by your team's buffs as well. So if you have your team buffing you with a high crit chance weapon, you'll get much better benefit. When it comes to the Rubico, you're going to be prioritizing multi-shot, crit chance, crit damage, and on any of these weapons that you use for Eidolons, you're going to want to prioritize radiation. Radiation is the only damage type Eidolons are specifically weak to, although they are weak to cold as well. Radiation is fundamentally where you want to go for with this. Keeping in mind, because they are only weak to radiation for the most part, you don't want to strip all of the Eidolon's armor, because if you strip all the armor, you no longer gain as potent of a buff from that radiation damage. When it comes to shooting the Eidolon, you do actually gain a benefit from hitting the head part of the Eidolon. However, in most situations, trying to actually hit that damn thing is going to be harder, easier said than done. So, prioritize multi-shot, prioritize crit damage, prioritize just pumping out as much damage as you can. The great thing about Rubico as well is it is hit stand, meaning you can fire very freaking fast. And the Lancer is the second of the weapons you would use in the quote-unquote meta. Lancer, much like Rubico, is going to be prioritizing a lot towards crit chance, crit damage, and multi-shot. However, Lancer has a default amount of electrical damage, which really aids towards that radiation damage it comes with. When it comes to Lancer as well, it is advisable to put some fire rate on it in the form of vial acceleration or something of that nature, as it is a charge-based weapon. However, the raw damage this thing has more than makes up for that. Something to keep in mind of Lancer is it is not hit scan. It requires you to premeditatively aim and predict where the Eidolon is moving so you can hit, because you have a travel time with the projectile. The damage of this weapon is immensely powerful. Even with some simple modding, it is more than capable of being able to deal heavy damage to an Eidolon, even with very subpar modding. The third weapon of this list is the Opticore. Modding for radiation, multi-shot, and crit chance is the way to go with this weapon, as with all of these weapons. The Opticore is a charge-based weapon, so you're going to have to be very, very careful, as it does take a while to actually fire, so you need to be predictive with where you're aiming. Much like the Lancer, you'll have a very similar build, having vial acceleration or some fire rate to make it a bit more efficient with how long it takes to shoot. It is definitely not my most used weapon for this, as there are definitely better choices. However, for the sake of how much damage it can do and from benefiting from buffs, this weapon is great, and I would highly recommend giving it a try if you get the opportunity to. So hopefully this guide has been somewhat informative for you. Hopefully you found some information here useful. And if you have enjoyed it, make sure you press the like button, maybe subscribe to the channel, and if you felt like joining us in these guides as we do record these on stream for you all to take part in, then feel free to drop the link down below, a click and join us on Twitch sometime. We'd be more than happy to have you join us on one of these lovely streams. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see all of you top handers in the next video. Ta-ra!